right, today we're going to start talking about the period of time after Vietnam and the nation kind of turns toward a new era. We're going to start talking about the Nixon years and some of the challenges that it brought, Nixon's leadership style, and how he gets himself into trouble in the Watergate. So, beyond the turmoil of Vietnam, Nixon administration did do some successful things. Obviously, it's going to be seen now through the prism of Vietnam and Watergate, but there are some positive things that he does. We're going to talk about his politics, his domestic policy. Talk about his foreign policy, where he probably enjoyed the most success, and also trouble in the Middle East, as well as some major social and cultural events going on during that time. So Nixon was a conservative. He believed the federal government was too large after the expansions under the Great Society of LBJ. And he also began this idea of a Southern strategy to appeal to conservative Southerners, specifically former segregationists, people that were opposed to some of the civil rights movement. And he also was what he called a law and order candidate, firm stand against crime and against drug use. However, on the other side, Nixon also had some pretty liberal domestic policies. He increased funding for some federal programs like food stamps, increased Social Security payments. He was focused. He passed or signed many laws about the environment and ensuring the protection of the environment. He also created a new organization to prevent work-related injuries and death, and that's OSHA, Occupational Safety Health Administration. He also advanced affirmative action. So even though he was a conservative politician, he did have areas where he enacted pretty liberal policies. All right, Nixon called his domestic policy the New Federalism. And again, he thought the government was too large. So the feature was, rather than growing the federal government to do some of these programs, he thought it was a better idea to give money to the states to enact those programs, states and local governments, through grants and loans and things of that nature. He believed that local governments were better at spending taxpayer money than the federal government. He did establish a Southern strategy, and one that's had a huge impact on American politics ever since. I mean, the South is now solidly Republican, but before that, it was solidly Democratic. So he worked to weaken some of the key civil rights legislation in order to shore up his Southern support. He also urged a slowdown in forced integration. He opposed busing of children to schools outside of their own neighborhoods in order to reach integration. And he wanted local governments to take action on civil rights issues themselves. Of course, this was much more popular in the South than LBJ's policy of enforcing it with the federal government. He also opposed federal court limits to put court rulings to put limits on the power of police and Miranda rights and Gideon versus Wainwright and those types of things. He sought to name conservative justice to the federal court, and he actually was able to have as much impact on the court probably as any president in history. He filled 4 openings on the Supreme Court, although 2 of his nominees were rejected. But 4 openings, almost half the court was filled by Nixon during his presidency. Environmentalism was a concern of his. It was during his presidency that Rachel Carson published the seminal work, The Silent Spring, which really shined a light on the problems, the abuses of the American environment, DDT and other kind of threats, and really kind of sparked the modern environmentalist movement. He signed because of that pressure, he signed the Clean Air Act and also established the environmental protection agencies. And these were important steps towards securing the future of the environment. Also, he signed the Occupational Safety and Health Act, which created OSHA, an organization that tries to prevent injuries and deaths at work. And as well, he extended affirmative action programs to not just to African Americans, which they already covered, but also extended affirmative action to women to try to end the glass ceiling. Foreign policy is the place where Nixon has the most success, I think, as a president. And part of this is because he has a great national security advisor by the name of Henry Kissinger, who later he named Secretary of State. And Kissinger really shapes a lot of Nixon's foreign policy. And Kissinger believed the old Prussian idea of realpolitik. This is the idea of basing your foreign policies on realistic views of what's good for national interests rather than broad rules or principles or morals. Nixon, as a result, took steps to ease tensions with some of the Cold War enemies, specifically with China. And he also is going to ease tensions with the Soviet Union. This is a policy called détente. And the idea is you couldn't exist on a war footing forever without a crisis happening. So Kissinger believed the United States should consider each foreign policy question from a standpoint of what's best for America, not what necessarily what's wrong or what's right, but what's best for the United States. And that the government shouldn't necessarily be bound to fight communism or promote freedom wherever it was threatened if it wasn't in the best interest of the United States. And this marks a significant change from the policy of containment as practiced by Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson. So as a result of this, he begins talks, excuse me, in 1969 to slow the development of arms. He begins talks with the Soviet Union to slow the arms race, and this becomes known as SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. Both nations had been increasing their numbers, and basically they were making innovations in weapons technology and defenses and things of that nature. As a result of the talks, Nixon and Brezhnev, who was the new premier in the Soviet Union, agreed to the anti-ballistic missile treaty. And then they began after SALT I, they began a second round of discussions. Also at the same time, he's improving relations with China. And the idea is that if you have a better relationship with China, then that puts pressure on the Soviet Union. Because the Soviet Union and China, even though they were both communists, had always been kind of rivals in Asia. He does this secretly, and all of a sudden Americans wake up one day and they find that Nixon has visited China. And basically, they have discussions between Nixon and Mao, and it does lead to a thaw that later on is going to turn into a very close, at least economic relationship between the two countries. Now, during Nixon's administration, the Middle East becomes problematic. In 1967, well, this happened during Johnson's administration, but in 1967, you had the Six-Day War where Israel occupied territory that belonged to Egypt, Syria, and Jordan after it had been attacked. So it was attacked by these countries and then invaded and occupied some territory. The UN passed a resolution that called for Israel to withdraw from those lands and for the Arab states to recognize Israel's right to exist. It bears noting that the UN declaration, the UN resolution that was passed, has never been followed by either side in the war. But during the Nixon administration, you had the Yom Kippur War. Egypt and Syria again attacked Israel, and the fighting affected the United States because the United States funded and helped the Israeli military to fight the war. And as a result, OPEC nations got together and imposed an oil embargo on the United States. So the oil embargo had a huge, massive impact. So they didn't, the OPEC countries agreed not to ship oil to the United States and certain other countries who supported Israel. So OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, stops shipping oil to the United States. And the United States, of course, was dependent on foreign oil, specifically Middle Eastern oil, and it causes serious problems in the U.S. economy. So what Nixon does is send Kissinger to engage in shuttle diplomacy. So Kissinger will kind of go back between the two sides to try to come to a deal. Eventually, the fighting was ended. Kissinger was able to broker a deal, and the oil embargo was lifted, much to everybody's happiness. All right, so you do have a video. We're going to talk about the moon landing, and I want you to watch this video on the website. So make sure you do watch that. All right, so major events during the Nixon administration. Well, probably the one that had the biggest cultural impact was NASA and the Apollo 11 space mission in 1969, July 16th, 1969. Apollo 11 takes off, and 4 days later, Neil Armstrong becomes the first man to walk on the moon. Of course, utters the famous words you heard in the video: one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Nixon was worried about the high rates. Still worried about high rates of inflation and unemployment. So he actually intervenes using executive authority, which is kind of goes against his conservative principles. But he orders a 90-day freeze of wages and prices in order to stop inflation from rising. And they work temporarily, but ultimately are not successful in stopping rising inflation.